Hey guys, Peter here to do an album review. Today I'm here to tell you about the debut record from Sanguisugabogg, Tortured Whole, out March 26 on Century Media Records. The album has 11 tracks, 34 minutes in length. They are a brutal death metal band from the USA. Now, as far as structure is concerned, this is a record that has a very simple approach to it. At least it comes across that it has a very simpler and linear structure overall that allows the album to be fluid, to be dynamic, but still be very cohesive and really put forward the attributes that it has, which is heaviness and brutality. And those come at you from the time you press play all the way to the end. It's an album that transports some of those elements from track to track, but the tracks live almost independently of each other. So while having some of the same elements, some similarities, if you will, in the way they're constructed, in the way the soundscape comes across, the tracks don't really need the one that came before or the one that comes after in order for them to survive, in order for them to feel complete. They work as independent tracks, but then in the big picture of the albums, they still fit together and they still work well with others. Now, one of the things about the structure that I really enjoyed was the inclusion of interlude tracks. For an album like this that's very brutal, very relentless from the get-go all the way to the end, you almost need a few interlude tracks to just kind of break the routine, break the mold, allowing you to reset yourself and have a better appreciation for what's coming around the corner. It also doesn't allow the album to feel repetitive. It breaks the routines, it breaks everything that you had up until that certain point. You reset yourself because the interlude takes you into a different place musically. It gives you something else to digest that you haven't really heard before. So then when the album starts off again, you feel like you're just starting from scratch. And that's a very important element for this album. The other part of the interludes that's very interesting is that they didn't use the same approach on all of them. They took different avenues to get exactly where they needed to go. And this is an important aspect because it allows them to feel different, it allows them to be different, but still achieve the same exact goal. And that's true pretty much of the rest of the record, because this is not an album that has necessarily patterns or that has one size fits all approach, either be with the soundscape or with the vocals or with the structure. It really gives you different feels, different looks with every single song, allowing you to have something else to really gravitate or hold on to while enjoying that track before moving on to the next song and then holding on to something completely different. So it's a very dynamic album from that perspective. The structure, the interlude tracks really help bringing it a little bit more into the forefront. As far as the soundscape is concerned, I mean, it's brutal sound from top all the way to the bottom, but I felt like it was a brutal sound that it wasn't muddied, it wasn't dirty. You didn't have to kind of like move layers in order to define or feel the definition of all the different parameters that make the soundscape of the album. So that is kudos to the band for being able to create an album that has this much aggression, that has this much volume, this much thickness of sound coming at you on every single track, and still be very well defined within its parameters and very well defined within all of the elements. You can really break down what every single thing is doing, what every single instrument is bringing to the table, and it's creating in order for the record to have that full wall of sound but still be very well defined within the small pieces that makes up the larger picture. And those small pieces are definitely the drums and bass. The combo of those two is very important. The guitars and vocals, to me, these are the three driving forces, the three elements that really pull you one way or another as you progress through this record. In some tracks you're going to get more of one, less of the other, in terms of being the drivers of the sound, the drivers of the experience, but all three have very important and distinct roles in the enjoyment of this record. Going in with the drums and bass, the combo of these two is extremely important from a foundation perspective. Because if you're going to create an album that has a lot of sound, that has a lot of presence, that is heavy, that's aggressive, that has a lot of intensity, the drums and bass have to cooperate, work well together in order to create the foundation, in order to create the pillars of the sound of the experience. I felt on this record, you're definitely going to do that. At times, the drums and bass together felt groovy. They felt like they had volume, they felt like they have depth and warmth of sound, and in some cases they were a little bit depleted of those because you were getting that same sensation from the guitars or from the vocals. So the drums had a consistent role but dynamic at the same time, because like I said, not a one size fits all and you're going to get the same sound on every single track. I felt like they deviated from the beaten path every so often, sometimes within the same track, in order to create some mechanisms that allow the song to have a little bit of life and not just feel like it's flatlining from the beginning all the way to the end. Same thing could be said for the guitars, but I felt like the guitars had a little bit more of a boundary, if you will, in terms of how far off the beaten path they could go. They were always pushing the songs forward, but they were pushing the songs forward sometimes with drive and sometimes with heaviness, with volume, with depth, with layers. Those were the two momentums, and they never really deviated from those two. More often than not, the guitars sound very chunky. They feel like they have a lot to them, and that allows the sound to be heavy but also to be grounded, working really well with what you're getting out of the drums and bass. So the guitars kind of complement that same sound at times and really allows the overall experience to be one that just really penetrates within you and stays with the listener as you go along through the ride of that track. When they become a little bit more driven, when they become a little bit more melodic, because that also happens, or even a little bit groovier, you feel the song changing on its axis. You feel like there's something happening. The drums are starting to stay in a consistent place to give you the track some cohesiveness, and the guitars are trying to pull things into a different direction. But those pulls never stay in for too long. I never felt like this was an album where the guitars were pulling in one direction and the whole track was going into the other. There are some pulls, there are some contractions and some expansions of sound throughout the album, throughout the tracks, but it always comes back to the starting point. So this is a record that gives you different feels, different looks, but always comes back to what they know best, and that is what grounds the overall sound experience of this album. Once you get into the vocals, perhaps the most dynamic element of the album, and I was expecting that to be the case. On a brutal record like this, you're always going to get vocals that kind of feel the temperature of the room or the temperature of the song, and they're going to deliver you a specific output depending on where you are within the record and where you are within the tracks. And it's definitely the case with this album, and it's definitely the case with every single song in it. So you're going to get a little bit of everything. It's going to be a very dynamic approach. It's not a one-size-fits-all. There are repetitions as far as the elements and the styles and the approaches being used from the first to the last track, but because they're coming at you from different angles and with different songs, with different looks, different lyrics, different approaches, it never really sounds like you've heard it before, even though you have. So there's always a fresh feel with every single track from a vocal perspective, and that's important in order to keep the wheels turning, in order to keep the album moving, and not give the listener a sense that you've been there before, you've been down this road before. Even though, like I said, you have been there, it's just there's a different approach. They're delivering you the same elements, but perhaps with a different recipe, and that is enough to change the eyesight of the listener as you progress across all 11 tracks. Now, overall, this is a very solid record, considering that this is a debut album. When I look at the sound output, the overall sound that this album has, how well defined it is, and at the same time how heavy, how aggressive, and how much volume it carries, it's really kudos to the band for being able to release a debut record that has this sort of professional output to it. It doesn't feel like a debut record. It feels like a record from a band that understands exactly what they want out of their sound in the studio while still capturing a lot of their live essence in it at the same time. And that's exactly how this album comes across. A little bit of studio, but a lot of what this band will give you in a live performance. You just feel it, the organic aspect of how the tracks come together and how they're delivered. So for a debut album, I was extremely pleased with the output that this record has, with the overall quality that it carries, and the structure, how intelligent they were by creating these interludes throughout the overall structure of the album really showcases their IQ as far as understanding their genre, their sound, their band, and how they can make an album as dynamic, as fluid, and not as repetitive as possible. Now, getting into my favorite songs, I want to start off with Dragged by a Truck, a song that has a lot of ups and downs. The guitars drive the sound, the drums and bass create the foundation, which is pretty much true on every single track, but on this one becomes a little bit more noticeable. But the three really work well together in order to create the heaviness, the thickness of sound, the volume that you need to really push the overall atmosphere forward. It has different kind of momentums as you move across. It's an album that moves faster at times, it moves slower in others, but all of these changes, all of these different approaches make the track feel a lot more dynamic, giving it the necessary ups and downs, the ebbs and flows, in order for the track to be fluid and dynamic at the same time. Next, Tortured Whole, a song that's more methodic in its approach. It doesn't have that pedal to the metal kind of style. It just moves at a slower pace, and what it loses in speed, it gains in heaviness and gains in aggression. So it's a song that has a lot of that, and it almost feels like a snowball effect. It's a track that feels like it gets heavier as it progresses. It becomes more aggressive as it progresses, even though, like I said, it's progressing at a very slow, methodic pace. but I think that's an important aspect because it allows the song to flatline at times, and then the vocals become a little bit more controlled. They follow into that pattern. They don't go outside of the boundaries, and makes the song feel a lot more tighter, a lot more cohesive, even though it's expanding and contracting as you progress through it. But those expansions and contractions don't feel as abrupt. They don't feel as far apart from each other because the overall song really stays connected, really stays tight, and never really breaks apart. Last but not least, Posthumous Compersion. This is the shortest track on the album. It's just around the 1 minute mark. But just because it's 1 minute, it doesn't mean it's not a great track. I really enjoy this song because I was expecting it to be balls to the wall from the moment it starts, because you have really a short amount of time to work with. It was not the case. It's not a methodic track, but it's something in between. It's like a mid-tempo song that has a lot of intent, that really balances out. It's built on aggression and heaviness. Those are the two key factors that move this song along, that really push this track from the beginning all the way to the end, allowing the vocals to be the driver of the track, even though the sound behind those vocals is still very heavy, still very potent. It still carries a lot of weight. This is a song that you really feel like you gravitate towards the vocals, and the vocals are guiding your experience as you progress through the song from the beginning to the end. This is it, guys. This is Sanguisugabogg with Tortured Whole, out March 26 on Century Media Records. Let me know your thoughts on the band, on the singles. Use the comment section below. I'll be reading those and getting back to you. Take care, guys.